For 5 centuries, we have handed the discovery of America to one man, Columbus. His name fills the textbooks and stands on the monuments, and he was nearly 500 years too late. The Norse were already there. We have always told ourselves a comfortable version of this. They blew off course in a storm, landed somewhere cold, looked around, and sailed home, never to return. A footnote, a legend, something half imagined. I started with a simpler question. How does a treeless island build ocean-going ships? That question led me somewhere I did not expect, because 2 separate forensic trails have quietly rewritten the footnote into something far stranger. One trail runs through wood, the other runs through blood. The wood told us they kept coming back again and again for centuries. The DNA told us who came back with them, and what should have been there afterward, and simply was not. To understand any of this, you have to start at the far western edge of the known European world. In the late 10th century, that edge was Greenland. Beyond it, on every map the Norse could draw, there was nothing but open ocean and the rumor of something on the other side. The man who put them there was named Eric the Red. He was not a settler by temperament. He was an exile, driven out of Iceland after a feud turned to killing, given 3 years to be gone or be outlawed for good. So he sailed west into the unknown, and for 3 years he explored a coastline no European had farmed before. He found a hard country of deep, cold fjords, 2 narrow strips of habitable land separated by hundreds of miles of barren ice. And when his exile ended and he sailed back to Iceland, he did something that tells you a great deal about the man. He gave the place a name designed to sell it. He called it Greenland. It was a piece of marketing, plain and simple, a green promise stretched over a land that was anything but. And the strange thing is, it worked. 25 ships set out behind him. Only 14 survived the crossing. The rest were swallowed by the same ocean they were trying to conquer. But the 14 that made it landed and stayed. And against every reasonable expectation, they built a world. They raised farms along the fjords. They built churches. They built a cathedral of stone at a place called Gardar. They imported the entire apparatus of medieval European life and set it down at the edge of the ice, thousands of miles from anyone who shared their language or their faith. But Greenland was never going to make it easy. The summers were barely 3 months long. The soil was thin and grudging, the harvests poor. And there was one shortage that mattered more than all the others, one gap in the land that no amount of stubbornness could close. Greenland had almost no wood. You have to understand what that meant to these people, because for the Norse, wood was not a convenience. It was survival itself. It was the material their entire civilization was built on. Their houses, their barns, their tools, their furniture, the handles of everything they owned, and above all, their ship. A single ocean-going vessel demanded an enormous quantity of strong, straight timber. The keel, the ribs, the planking, the mast, the oars, the steering board, every piece of it had to endure punishing seas and grinding Arctic ice. You could not build that out of scraps. You could not improvise it. And scraps were all Greenland offered. The only trees that grew there were dwarf birch and willow, stunted shrubs that crept along the ground and rarely rose higher than a man. They were barely fit for kindling, let alone for building a boat that could cross hundreds of miles of open water. The land gave them nothing to build with, and yet they kept building. They kept houses standing. They kept boats in the water. They kept crossing the sea. This is the puzzle that sits underneath the entire story, and for a long time it had no answer. Here was a society that ran on lumber, planted in a country with no lumber to speak of, and it did not merely survive there. It lasted for centuries. It built cathedrals and launched ships and maintained contact with a continent across the ocean, all without a forest of its own to draw on. So scholars ask the obvious question, the one that refuses to go away. Where did the wood come from? Not just enough to scrape by, but enough to sustain a shipbuilding people for generations after generations. How did they get it? How often did they go? And how far were they willing to sail to bring it home? For a long time, those questions had only guesses for answers. Then someone went looking in the one place no one had thought to check. Not in the sagas. In the wood itself. The answer came from a study out of the University of Iceland, and the method behind it is worth pausing on, because it turns a pile of old splinters into a witness that cannot lie. Archaeologists gathered the wood that the Norse had left behind, not grand timbers or finished beams, but fragments, the broken and discarded remains of a working society, pulled from the ruins of several farmsteads across Greenland. In all, they had 8,552 pieces to examine. And rather than guess at where each one came from, they put them under the microscope. This is the forensic turn, and it is a quiet kind of brilliance. Every tree species leaves a signature inside its own wood. The size and arrangement of the cells, the thickness of the cell walls, tiny anatomical features unique to particular families of trees. To the naked eye, a splinter is just a splinter. Under magnification, it carries a fingerprint. And that fingerprint says, with real precision, what kind of tree this wood was cut from. And, by extension, where on earth that tree could possibly have grown. So they read the fingerprints, one fragment at a time. And for the overwhelming majority, the answer was exactly what everyone expected. Most of the wood was driftwood, and most of that driftwood was Siberian. Whole logs torn loose from the forests of northern Russia, carried out to sea, and dragged across the top of the world by the slow Arctic currents until they washed up on Greenland's beaches, free for the taking. Another portion was pine and spruce from Scandinavia, brought across the North Atlantic as trade goods and as the timbers of the ships themselves. None of this was surprising. It matched the historical record. It matched what the sagas implied. It confirmed a picture scholars had already half drawn. And then there was the anomaly. Among the thousands of fragments, a small group stood apart. 26 pieces: oak, beech, hemlock, jack pine. And here is what made those 26 pieces extraordinary. None of those species grew in Greenland. None of them grew in Iceland. None of them grew anywhere in Scandinavia. And none of them grew along the currents that carried the Siberian driftwood. There was only one place on the planet where all 4 of those trees grew together within reach of a Norse ship. North America. The forests around the Gulf of St. Lawrence and down the Labrador coast, where oak and beech and hemlock and jack pine stood in abundance, close enough to the water to be cut and carried away. Now, you could try to explain that away as more driftwood, more lucky cargo handed up by the sea. But the wood itself refuses that explanation. These fragments showed clear marks of human work. Cut marks left by metal tools, surfaces shaped and worked for a purpose, and most telling of all, the wood had been taken from the bases of living trees. This was fresh timber, felled on purpose and chosen for its strength, not weathered gray driftwood scavenged off a beach. And then geography closes the door completely. Siberian driftwood can reach Greenland, because there is an Arctic current that carries it there. But there is no current on Earth that carries hemlock or jack pine from the coast of North America to the shores of Greenland. Those trees grow entirely outside the Arctic current systems. For their wood to end up in a Greenland farmstead, the ocean could not have brought it. Only people could. Someone cut those trees, loaded them onto a ship, and sailed them home across the Davis Strait. There is one more detail, and it quietly reframes everything. All 26 of the North American fragments came from a single site. Gardar, the cathedral, the seat of Greenland's bishop and the most powerful farmstead in the colony. This was not wood that ordinary farmers could get their hands on. It was a luxury, reserved for the wealthy and the powerful, the kind of thing only an elite household could afford to send ships across an ocean to collect. Which means this was never one desperate accident. It was organized, it was deliberate, and it kept happening. The wood told us they kept going back. But wood, on its own, can always be argued with. You need a place, you need a settlement you can stand inside, walls you can touch, a hearth where someone cooked a meal. And in 1960, that is exactly what someone found. On the northern tip of Newfoundland, at a windswept spot called Lance aux Meadows, archaeologists uncovered the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement. Not a campsite, not a rumor. The foundations of long houses built in the Scandinavian style, workshops, and the thing that settled the argument cold, an iron smelting furnace. The indigenous peoples of North America did not smelt iron. The Norse did. This was European, and it was sitting on North American soil. For the first time, the sagas had a foundation under them. Here was the earliest confirmed European settlement in the New World, planted nearly 5 centuries before Columbus was born. That alone would have been enough to rewrite the textbooks. But in 2021, researchers did something that still feels almost impossible. They dated the settlement to a single exact year. The method is one of the most elegant pieces of detective work in modern archaeology, and it depends on a moment when the sky itself left a mark. In the year 992, a burst of cosmic radiation struck the Earth. It was invisible to anyone living through it, but it left a fingerprint, a sudden spike in radiocarbon that was absorbed by every growing tree on the planet that year. Cut open a log that was alive in 992, and that one ring carries the signature of that cosmic event, a marker stamped into the wood at a known moment in time. So the researchers found that ring in the timber at Lance aux Meadows, and then they simply counted outward. Ring by ring, year by year, from the cosmic marker to the bark, to the moment the tree was felled. The count came to 29. 29 years after that burst of radiation, which lands you on the year 1021. That is the year the Norse were cutting wood at Lance aux Meadows. Not roughly, not approximately, exactly. A precise date, pulled out of a tree ring, for Europeans standing in North America 471 years before Columbus. And with that date in hand, the old stories stopped sounding like stories. The medieval Icelandic sagas, written down around the year 1000, had spoken of voyages westward to lands rich in forest and game. They named one of those lands Markland, the land of forests, a place historians now match to the Labrador coast. The sagas said Greenlanders sailed there for timber. For centuries, that was treated as poetry, as embellishment, as the kind of thing medieval storytellers invented to fill a long winter night. The wood and the date together say otherwise. The sagas were carrying a core of truth all along. But here's the detail that stays with you about Lance aux Meadows. When the Norse left it, they left it cleanly. There was no sign of disaster, no massacre, no fire, no bodies in the ruins. The valuables were gone. They had packed up and walked away in good order, the way you leave a house you might one day return to. And it seems they did return, at least now and then. There is evidence the site was still being used as late as the middle of the 1100s, more than a century after it was first built. So now we have far more than a footnote. We have a place. We have walls and a furnace. We have an exact year. We have sagas that turned out to be telling the truth. We know where the Norse landed, and we know, to the year, when they were there. What we still do not have is the one thing that matters most. We know the where, and we know the when. We do not yet know the WHO. And that answer was never going to come from a tree ring or a furnace, or a saga. To find it, you have to stop reading the wood and start reading the blood. Reading the blood is harder than reading the wood, and for a long time it was simply impossible. Ancient DNA is fragile. It breaks down, it scatters, it contaminates, and the people we are chasing left almost no bodies to test. So for decades there was a silence here. The wood could be measured, the settlements could be dug, but the question of who actually crossed that ocean and who came back had no way of being answered at all. Then the genome finally spoke. The first signal came not from Greenland and not from North America, but from Iceland and from people who are alive right now. In 2010, geneticists studying Icelandic family lines found something that should not have been there. A lineage of mitochondrial DNA, the kind passed down only from mother to child, unbroken generation after generation. They named it C1e, and it did not belong to Europe. It did not belong to Asia. It was Native American. Sit with how strange that is. Mitochondrial DNA traces a single thread back through the mother's mother, and hers before that, all the way down. This particular thread, living in several Icelandic families, did not lead back to Scandinavia. It led back across the Atlantic to the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And when the researchers traced how long it had been in Iceland, the line ran back roughly 1,000 years, to around the year 1000. The exact window when the Norse were sailing west to Vinland and back. There is really only one way that thread reaches Iceland. Somewhere around the year 1000, a Native American woman crossed the ocean in a Norse ship. Not as a sailor, almost certainly not by choice. She was carried east, away from her own continent, to an island on the far side of the world. And there she had children, and those children had children. And her DNA, the thread that runs only through mothers, survived every generation between her and the present day. A single person, whose name we will never know, whose ancestry rode home in Norse blood and is still walking around Iceland 1,000 years later. Of everyone who took part in this story, she may be the only individual the genome can actually point to. Around that one astonishing thread, the wider science was filling in the picture of the people who carried her. The great Viking genome studies and the work on the Greenland Norse themselves revealed something that should sound familiar by now. The Norse were never one pure tribe sweeping out of Scandinavia. They were already a mixture, ancestry pulled from across northern Europe and beyond, stitched together by centuries of raiding and trading and settling. A people assembled from many streams, who then sailed those streams to the very edge of the world. The blood confirmed what the wood had hinted. These were not accidental wanderers. They were a far-flung, deeply connected, deliberately mobile people, and North America was simply the last and longest reach of that web. And then comes the turn. The detail that gives this whole story its unease. If you line up everything we now know, the picture seems to be building towards something large. Centuries of timber voyages, a confirmed settlement, sagas that told the truth. A Native American woman whose line survives in Iceland to this day. All of it says contact. Real, sustained, repeated contact between two worlds. And contact like that, everywhere else in human history, leaves a mark. It leaves a thick, two-way trail in the blood. Peoples who meet, mix. But when you go looking for that trail, for the genetic evidence of all this contact flowing the other way, into the populations of North America, into the descendants of the Norse who kept coming back, you find almost nothing at all. The thread runs in one direction, and then it stops. One woman's line carried east survives. The vast exchange you would expect from centuries of crossings simply is not there. If they kept coming back, the blood should be everywhere. It is almost nowhere. And that absence is the real mystery. To understand why that silence is so strange, you have to understand what contact normally does. When two peoples meet and keep meeting, history almost never stays tidy. They trade, they fight, they marry. They have children who belong to both worlds and to neither. And the record of all that mixing settles into the blood, where it stays for thousands of years. We have watched it happen everywhere. When the Sumerians shared their valley with their neighbors, the two peoples slowly dissolved into one, and the genome remembers it. When Europe met the Americas in 1492, the genetic consequences were vast, brutal, and permanent, written into entire continents of living people. Sustained contact leaves a thick, two-way trail. That is simply what it does. So when you find a contact that lasted centuries and left almost no trail at all, something in the story does not add up. And that is exactly the situation the Norse leave us with. They crossed the Davis Strait again and again. They cut timber on the North American coast and carried it home. They built at Lance aux Meadows and used it for over 100 years. By every measure we have, this was not a single visit. It was a relationship that ran for generations. And yet you can search the indigenous populations of North America for the genetic fingerprint of all those Norse arrivals, and you come up with essentially nothing. No lasting Norse signature in the people who were already there. No fusion, no blending of the kind that contact almost always produces. This is the part of the story where intellectual honesty matters most, because it would be easy to overreach here, and the evidence does not allow it. The ancient samples are few. Preservation in these climates is poor. The conclusions are still provisional, and they may shift as more remains are tested and more sites are found. Anyone who tells you the genetics are settled is selling you something, but the shape of the answer is already clear enough to be unsettling. The trail runs one way, and it runs thin. So why? Why would the longest early contact between Europe and the Americas leave a near silence where there should have been a bloodline? The honest answer is that several things were probably true at once. The contact was real, but it was narrow. It was not a migration. It was a trickle of timber expeditions, a handful of ships crewed by a handful of men, financed by a wealthy few and aimed at cutting wood, not building a new society. The Greenland colony that launched these voyages was tiny to begin with, a few thousand people at its peak, clinging to 2 strips of habitable coast. A population that small simply does not have the numbers to flood a continent with its ancestry, and the distances were murderous. Every crossing of the Davis Strait was a gamble against ice and storm, the kind of journey you made for profit and survived if you were lucky, not the kind you made to settle down. And then there was the welcome. The sagas remember the people the Norse met in these lands. They called them the Skraelings. And the relationship, by the Norse account, curdled almost immediately. Early curiosity gave way to suspicion to violence. The sagas describe trade that collapsed into bloodshed, attacks that the small Norse parties could not withstand. A few hundred newcomers, an ocean away from any reinforcement, could not hold ground against the people who had lived on that continent for thousands of years, so they did the only thing they could. They took what timber they could reach, and they left. Which gives us the strangest verdict of all. This was contact without consequence. A door pushed open and then pulled shut so completely that the blood barely registers it happened. The wood proves they came. The single Icelandic thread proves at least one person went back with them. And the vast emptiness everywhere else proves how shallow the whole thing finally was. A relationship that lasted centuries and changed almost nothing. A thread stretched that thin across an ocean was never going to hold. And in the end, it did not. The end came in stages, and the North American outposts were the first to go. Lance aux Meadows was not destroyed. It was simply let go. The Norse packed up what mattered, left the walls standing, and stopped coming. The timber voyages to Markland may have carried on for a while longer, a fading habit kept up by fewer and fewer ships. But the foothold on the continent itself quietly closed. The door that had been pushed open around the year 1000 swung shut, and on the western side of the ocean there was soon no one left to open it again. Greenland held on longer, but Greenland was dying too, and dying slowly. For a few centuries the colony had worked, balanced on a knife edge between a hard land and a stubborn people. Then the edge gave way. The climate turned against them. The warm spell that had let them farm the fjords faded into what we now call the Little Ice Age, and the summers grew shorter and crueler than ever. The thin soil gave less. The harvests failed more often. The sea ice crept further down the coast and stayed longer, and every year the crossings that kept the colony alive grew more dangerous and less frequent. And the wider world was forgetting them. Europe in the 1300s and 1400s had troubles of its own. The plague swept the continent and emptied the markets that had once wanted Greenland's walrus, ivory, and Arctic goods. The ships from Norway came less and less until they stopped coming at all. A colony that had always depended on the lifeline across the ocean was left to face the ice alone. And one by one, the farms fell silent. We do not have a final scene, no last battle, no recorded death. We have only the ruins and the worked timber lying where it was left, and a silence that settles over the whole story by the middle of the 1400s. The Greenland Norse vanished as a people, and here is where this story parts ways with almost every other. When the Sumerians vanished, they did not really end. They dissolved into their neighbors and their conquerors and their heirs, and their blood was carried forward inside the ancestry of an entire region. Their thread never broke. It only changed hands. The Greenland Norse had no such inheritance. They left no successors, no population that absorbed them, no living descendants carrying their line forward out of that land. They reached the very edge of the world, held on for 400 years, and then disappeared into a genetic dead end. The thread did not change hands. It was simply a cut. The one thread that did survive ran the other way, and it ran impossibly thin. Not in Greenland, not in North America, in Iceland, in the blood of a few families, where a single Native American lineage has quietly endured for 1,000 years. The faintest possible pulse of a contact the wood had already proven was real. Everything else, the voyages, the cathedral, the settlement on Newfoundland, the centuries of crossings, left almost nothing behind in the one place it should have left everything. So when the title of all this promises that something was very wrong with the Vikings in America, this is what it means. There was nothing wrong with their ships, which were the finest of their age. Nothing wrong with their seamanship, which carried them across the cruelest ocean on Earth and back again, repeatedly, for generations. Nothing wrong with their courage, which is almost beyond comprehension. What was wrong was the result. The most sustained early meeting between Europe and the Americas, a meeting that lasted centuries and crossed an ocean again and again, left a near silence in the blood where history told us to expect a roar. They did not fail to reach America. They reached it, and reached it, and reached it again. They simply could not hold it, and could not be changed by it, and could not change it in return. And that emptiness, that strange genetic quiet on both sides of the water, is not a gap in the evidence. It is the evidence. The story of the Vikings in America is almost always told as a race. Who got there first, Columbus or the Norse? But after all of this, that feels like the smallest question in the room. The two trails tell something stranger. The wood proved they came back again and again, for centuries, cutting timber on a far shore and carrying it home across the ice. The blood proved that a single person rode home in their ships and survives in Iceland 1,000 years later. And the mark they should have left on a continent, the roar of all that contact, is almost nothing at all. They did not discover America and lose it. They touched it, harvested it, sailed home, and left it genetically untouched. The question was never who arrived first. It was why the longest early contact in history left a silence where there should have been a bloodline,